Welcome back, especially our 14 online viewers. This is the final session for our conference, and this is a session we're calling Comparisons and Conclusions. So we've got 2.5 hours. I've got the comments online, so if people want to ask questions or make comments, I will see those as they come in. My name's Nick Surratt, and I'm the Vice President of the Society for the History of Childhood and Youth, or Children and Youth. And the first thing we'll do is have some remarks from our 4 organizers here, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And then the last thing I've been told we want to do before we close out is have a discussion about whether a publication might result from all of this, what that might look like, and I think that's a pretty open-ended conversation. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Paula Fass.
Well, thank you, Nick. I mean, the first thing I really have to say is that this has been a great pleasure. I think all of the sessions have been wonderful, and I've learned from each and every one of them, and I suspect that all of you have learned something from the sessions. So I want to thank my co-organizers and the organizations that have sponsored us. It's been terrific. It's been a terrific couple of days. Very pleased about that. I have 4 comments, observations, and maybe we can have a conversation around them. Some of you know, maybe a lot of you know, that I began as a historian of the 1920s. And so some people still remember that I've written about the 1920s, and so I sometimes get journalists to ask me about the 1920s. A couple of years ago, a journalist from The Atlantic called me who wanted to write a comparison of the 2020s and the 1920s and wanted me to tell her everything I knew about the pandemic that took place between 1918 and 1920 and what the young people of that time made of the pandemic. And I said, nobody talked about it. And at least from my knowledge, I said, I don't remember anybody talking about that pandemic. And my argument at that point was very similar to what several people said yesterday, that it was absorbed into the larger context of the death in the war and in the general historical context. And what we remember is the war, and we don't remember the pandemic. So thinking about that and thinking about where we are today in the pandemic, it might be useful for us to think about, as Steve Mintz began our conversation with, the larger context within which the pandemic exists, and whether, in fact, over time, it's going to be something else that's remembered historically, whatever people remember personally. And I'll get back to this question of personal and historical in a minute. So that's my first comment. The second comment has to do with the issue of trauma. And it's quite wonderful. Anita's talked this morning about trauma and what its origins were and the historiography of trauma. Because the word has become a big bag of things. And we've thrown a lot of things into that word trauma. Some of that is irreparable. In other words, once it comes into the vocabulary, trauma covering a lot of bases, it's going to continue covering a lot of bases. It's impossible to retrieve it. But for our conversations, I do think it has been important and will be important to distinguish between different things. And among those different things are difficult experiences that create stress, experiences that subsequently have traumatic consequences. And here, Anita's reminder of that this morning was very important. And as I said to Jill and to Frederica earlier, death. We haven't talked about death as being something that some of these children, and adolescents for that matter, may in fact wind up in. I mean, trauma may not be the end of the line. I mean, if stress and hardship is the beginning of the line, death could be the end of the line. And so in our conversations, and especially with Joanna Miklik here, we need to remember that when children were taken from their families and displaced, in fact, some of those children who now can testify to their traumatic experiences would simply have not survived. They would not have been alive to talk about their trauma. That doesn't mean the trauma isn't deep and significant and important, but it does mean that trauma is part of a larger sequence of things. And it's not just the kids from Europe during the war, but the children that Jill deals with, those infants who could be shaken to death if they're not placed in another context, in a foster home. They may experience trauma over time, and no doubt they will, but in fact, they may also be saved from a situation in which they might have been killed and murdered, quite literally. So we should place trauma in the larger context of what the possibilities might have been, and that holds for all the various children that we've talked about. Okay, whether it's the Latinx children or it's the children who came from Cuba or children from Hungary, I mean, from a variety of different places. The third thing I wanted to mention, and it's something that Chris mentioned yesterday, and that is there really is a difference within ages in childhood. And whether we're talking about 3-year-olds or infants, or 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds matters. And the consequences for those children, or adolescents or teenagers, in terms of trauma or stress or death, for that matter, varies. And so it's important as historians, as sociologists, as psychologists, for us to distinguish between among the different ages of children. Except for Chris's point and something that Jill said today about infants up to the age of 3 being the ones who are most in danger, we haven't really talked about the difference in age. And so that someone who's displaced at 17 has a very different experience coming into a family than someone who's displaced at 4 or 5 or 6, or an infant, which is very unlikely but can also happen. So remembering the different experiences and the consequences for those children. And finally, and here, it's the historian more than anyone else talking, I do think that one of the things that's become very clear in this conference, and that needs to be continued, is what the intersection is between the psychological and the individual and the communal and the historical. And since it's the intersection between the psychological which is often, by the way, sociological rather than psychological, but between the individual when we are talking psychology and the historical. What is remembered? I mean, it may be individual testimonies that we use, but in fact, for historical meaning, for historical consequence and significance, it's usually more than an individual. It's a pattern that affects a larger group of people. And it's a pattern that's captured in statistics. It's a pattern that can be captured in multiple testimonies. But historians tend to want to talk not just about the individual experience, which can be, all over the place, but in fact about the general experiences and where they intersect. And one more word about the sociological and psychological, which I think is important. And it was pointed out yesterday, why am I forgetting her name? Catherine Newman, sorry. Catherine Newman was really talking about the role, the problematics of small communities and being an outsider in a small community, being, disregarded, and why those are the context within which those kinds of violent acts take place, because they're really acting against the entire community when they shoot like that around a classroom. It's the whole community that's being attacked. That's as much sociological as it is psychological. I was remembering that I went to a high school that had, hold on to your hats, 7,000 people in it. Okay, now that's a very different experience in terms of insider-outsider than a small community. I mean, there are multiple insider-outsider communities in a high school like that. So when we talk psychology and when we talk history, we should also remember the sociological context within which certain kinds of traumas, individual experiences, stress, and even death takes place. And death, of course, was something we did talk about yesterday. But it was, yeah. So, okay, those are my comments. I yield the floor to Bengt. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paula. And I will just kind of side with Paula in terms of my happiness about this project, about this meeting and this conference. I think it comes out so much better than would even imagine. So it's been a fabulous meeting you all and hearing all these interesting things. And it's wonderful to see how it interacts between the history and the social sciences in terms of addressing some of these issues. And it's clear that we definitely can learn from each other and perhaps learn new questions and stuff like that. I would like to add something which is very Swedish in a sense. I would like to add a discussion about government, state. I mean, this is in a sense very Swedish in a sense, is because we circle some of the things around what governments do and what they don't do and how that interacts. But I'd like to do that in relationship to the notions of children and childhood in different ways. So I'll have a couple of examples there. First of all, one thing that we have not talked about so much, and which kind of plays out in all these different cases, is actually the understanding of the best interests of the child as it is defined in the UN Convention and the role of the UN Convention. Let's take UN Convention as a symbol of a greater international framework of conventions about children, in which the United States unfortunately plays a very marginal role. Sometimes they credit themselves being the instrument of creating the UN Convention, which is something also naturally that the Scandinavian countries claim that they did, as well as Poland, which is kind of an interesting aspect of the whole thing. So this is an example of the competition about the understandings and definitions of children's rights and understanding of children. But it becomes important in this context because this convention grants children's rights of a certain kind. The interesting thing with these grants, rights, are that basically they are absolute. They should be taken care of. But what is neglected is the reality, in fact, that these rights should be guaranteed by national governments. So it's often the international government that gives these children these rights. It is national governments, and sometimes even worse, it is a regional government within the national government that actually does it. And they have rules and regulations regulating what they can pay money for. Can they pay social welfare benefits for a child that is not a Swedish citizen? No, they cannot. Cannot the state intervene and force the local government to give that? No, they can't, because we have a distinction between a national government and local government. So there's millions and myriads of different ways of complication in this case. And I think this comes in as being very important in terms of the way you portray children and understand children, because this thing with the right to best interest of the child has gone hand in hand with the redefinition of children. And you use the word becoming, children as becoming, and I think it's fundamentally in the whole child studies understanding of children that children are not becoming, they are beings. And as beings they have absolute rights in a sense, and they are resting in their place in this hierarchical system with all their rights and criteria. And it's interesting because that plays out very importantly, for example, in discussions about migration and unaccompanied individuals coming to a nation like Sweden. Because first of all, they are not protected by the Swedish law. They come to there, and we look upon them as competent individuals in their own rights, and they're ascribed basically and expected to be active citizens taking care of their rights in a sense. So perhaps they don't need all that much protection, because they should really be able to handle that themselves, because we expect a lot of our Swedish youth in a sense. And it's trying to also create a conflict there, because in reality they may be better served if they show an appropriate level of victimization, an appropriate level of vulnerability that will be something which may protect them from being extradited. Because if they are so competent, perhaps the competence in itself allows them to be reunited with their parents somewhere else in the world.
Yes.
And we spend, social welfare agencies and voluntary agencies, spend a lot of energy identifying. I mean, it's interesting. Normally, if we find a Swedish child walking around the streets of Stockholm and there's no parents around, the social welfare agencies put in an enormous amount of effort to find the parents. If we find an uncompetent immigrant coming and walking there, we leave it not to the government or to these government agencies, we leave it to the Red Cross. Could you see whether you find a parent to this child? And if they can't do it, then, well, this whole thing. So it's really a degree of handling this in different ways. And sometimes you could say that the whole issue, there's been a lot of things written about this, because it's, I mean, that victimization and vulnerability is something that comes in as something that is needed to be able to take action in different ways. And it's also the fact that we expect from Swedish youth an enormous amount of initiative and self-reliance and activity in society, in schools and stuff like that. And protest and political participation, protest and organizing political activity, that's what we basically expect from kids from 15 years and onwards. Very much schools are emphasized on. What happens if the Afghan unaccompanied children do the same thing? If they organize a protest rally demanding their rights outside the Swedish parliament, that's not good. That's not good, because they are claiming things unjust because they are not Swedish citizens and they do not have those rights. So this is just a point to the fact that I'm quite sure that you have other examples and can handle it in a different way. And I also like to point to the fact that the ambivalent role of governments when it comes to take responsibility for children in their care in the long run for what has happened to it. I and a couple of colleagues has been studying some 1,000 acts from the Swedish compensation scheme where they're going to compensate children for their maltreatment in state institutions. The state then says basically, well, most of you will get no compensations because you cannot prove this and this and this and that, and you're not falling under that rule and that rule and that rule, and should be. I mean, there's a lot of conditioning like that. But the worst thing is also that they say you should be treated. Your compensation is based on the criteria of which, at the time, children were brought up. I mean, you should be evaluated in relationship to those. And that's staggering, first of all, because how do we know the criteria, how people were brought up at the time? Historians are not that apt of showing exactly how that goes. And I would argue, when I can see it, it's actually much better treated children in the past than we would expect. But it's also the case that the state itself at that time, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, made very clear statements. Children should not be maltreated in government care. They should be having no cold showers, no physical abuse, no sexual abuse, etc., etc. No humiliating treatment, etc., etc. So the government today would say, no, what the government earlier said, it doesn't hold today. We're not responsible for that. So actually, you will get no compensations. Because after all, if you're a woman, you have to expect to be a little bit gravelled on and touched on and by men in your neighborhood. And perhaps if the farmer's son rapes you and the farmer did not know that, he is not responsible. So the state is not responsible. Because had he known it, but how could you prove that he knew it? So there's a whole set of... So it's really interesting. Sweden has the least granted cases in all these compensation schemes all over the world. Which is an interesting notion of understanding how everything looks at the state. Because we trust the state, we like the state, we believe in that the state can provide. But it doesn't also mean that we don't have the same underlying total conspiracy theory that pervades this nation about everything there. And I would only conclude by saying that if you look at the COVID situation there, it's interesting to see if you look at that, it's also very much a reflection on government from another perspective. The fact that the schools were held open during the COVID, it also resulted in less detrimental effect on cognitive things. It's less detrimental effect on psychological things. My English is really good, right? Things, I hope you understand. But it's also clear that this works best. It works like that because basically the Swedish government health organization says, well, health is physical health, but it's also emotional, which means that we cannot close the school because the school is the safest and best place for the children. So we have to provide for schooling for everybody, and that would be very detrimental if they did not. So I think that's, I just want to bring the state back into the discussion about children and the conceptions of childhood and the effects on trauma in different ways. Thank you.
Like Bengt, I'm also someone who does state
Yes, I know. I'm glad I got to say it first.
and public policy, so that was the best thing that could have certainly been said here. But to set me up. But I also wanted to thank everyone for all of their ideas, their contributions. This is really what motivated writing the grant to begin with, was to try to hear what people who were studying these important areas of children's experience, of what was happening in their lives, how the pandemic was affecting kids and our society, and bringing all of you together to talk about that. That was the real purpose here. So I really am grateful that you were able to share this with us, and I appreciate that. As someone who writes about children in the state, I think my major conclusion over my professional career has been that children are never the number one priority, even for things that look on the surface to be written for children. That instead, it's a fulfillment of adult needs and adult perspectives. So, for example, everyone is familiar with the argument that ending child labor in the 1930s was not really about ending child labor. It was about opening up jobs for adults. The 1935 Social Security Act included the first definition of childhood dependency and benefits for children. But when you mention Social Security to any American, they think of Social Security as old age pension. It's these kinds of things, I think, is just, you can trace it through American history when it comes to policy decisions. It's certainly also true about immigration policy. We can even go back into colonial times and talk about indentured servants and how most indentured servants were 15, 16, 17 years old. Those were all defined in ways to benefit the labor market for adults. I do think that the pandemic has the possibility, I'm going to try to be optimistic here, of opening up the door for the first time in American history for a focus on programs that benefited children. Now, did we follow through on this? No. If Americans had initially responded to the pandemic in a way that the most important thing was to keep kids in school, we would have behaved very differently than we did, okay? So I'm not trying to candy coat it and say it did, but let me give one example. Joe Biden's election in 2020 spurred a new wave of emergency government aid. And Jill talked about some of this this morning, and she and I had a discussion a little bit too, and I'd like to see us look a little bit more into this as we move forward, even use the historical perspective to look at past programs. Arguably, the Biden administration is the first in American history to emphasize improving the lives of children as a major form of government aid to the entire society. Now, let me explain that. As a consequence, at the close of 2021, the child poverty rate sank to a record low of 5.2%. Now, that's the new way that we measure poverty now. 20 years ago, it was measured a little bit differently, but this is the new way we look at it at 5.2%. And if anything, it gives us a 46% decline, if you just go percentage-wise, a 46% decline since 2020 in children's poverty. We tend to not talk about that, but that was huge. That was in 1 year. The American Rescue Plan that was passed under the Biden administration raised the child tax credit from $2,000 per child to $3,600 per child. Now, most Americans they may have even gotten that money in their pockets, but they haven't really processed how much money that was, particularly for low-income families. For children under 6 years of age, it was $3,000 and for children, $3,600 for children under 6 years of age, and $3,600 for children, or $3,000 for children 6 to 17. So, we're talking about $3,600, $3,000 per child, per family. That's a lot of money. No wonder it reduced the poverty rate almost in half. Like New Deal programs that appealed to the middle class, the tax credit was not limited by income or tax liability. So in other words, it didn't just go to poor families. It went to middle class families. It was therefore appealing. It did not feel like a government handout for most families. It felt like what was necessary in the time of the pandemic, an emergency. But also, like the Great Depression, for many people, it was also seen as a temporary aid during a crisis, not something that we should continue afterwards. The program immediately lifted 1 million children under 6 and 1.9 million children aged 6 to 17 out of poverty. So if we just talk about raw numbers, that's a lot of kids. It also was subsidized because unemployment insurance was subsidized by the federal government. So many people at the lowest income levels in America ended up making more money staying home as unemployed people than they made when they were working full-time, because the minimum wage in the United States has not gone up for more than 25 years. So, it's the same as it was in the late 1980s, and we have not changed it. So these are all important things to keep in this mind, that these were actually efforts that helped children directly, okay? So sadly for the nation's children, however, Congress failed to renew the expanded child's tax credit. And if you listen to even the Democratic senator who opposed renewing it, Senator Joe Manchin, he said that the reason why they should not renew it was because parents would choose to stay home or to buy drugs rather than go back to work. And as the pandemic was beginning to end, as the president told Americans, and there weren't enough people in the workforce, the drive was instead to get parents to go back to work rather than to lift children out of poverty. So again, that whole notion that even though the Biden administration started with this concept of helping children, the argument against it went back to our old pattern of the way that we've really devised public policy in the United States for adults. This really was underscored for me because I'm part of a philanthropic women's giving circle in Philadelphia that we help very small nonprofit organizations every year. It's a pretty small group of women, but we have enough money that it makes a significant difference to some of these small organizations. And their goal is to help primarily families and children. I mean, that's the mandate. This year, they decided to make the theme of this year, which is their record year for collecting money and distributing it, the year of the child. Now, I didn't have anything to do with that. I was just one of the people, in the group. And I couldn't help but be delighted as well as distressed. Because 1918, the time we last had a pandemic, was the year of the child, as designated by the United States Congress. And my first work in this field as a professional historian was on the U.S. Children's Bureau, which is what established the year of the child. So in 100 years, in over 100 years, I'm not sure we've really come that far, except that I wanted to be optimistic and saw this breakthrough from the Biden administration as the first time that we've actually seen kids put at the priority for a government aid benefit program. And oftentimes, if you're a policy historian, you see that things have to be passed many times, or at least attempted many times, before it actually becomes a remarkable change. So I'm going to end this being hopeful that maybe we've had some kind of a breakthrough. And I'm also thrilled to know that we have a new generation of people who maybe can help make it happen. Yeah, at least continue pushing that ball, and or that stone up the hill. I want to encourage you to continue to do that sort of thing. So thank you very much.
The pandemic created problems like learning loss or an increase in maltreatment of children. But as we all know, it also reinforced disturbing trends in childhood and brought many existing problems to light, especially involving inequality. This century has already brought about a revolution in childhood in this country. Not a revolution with cannons, barricades, but a revolution that's been so complete that it doesn't appear to have happened at all. Just take a look at some of the changes that have taken place in American childhood in this century. 1/4 of all American children have an immigrant parent, okay? Most children do not have a biological sibling. However, many have step-siblings at the same time. Most American children have not grown up with 2 biological parents. Only 2/3 describe themselves as exclusively heterosexual. Most have never dated regularly or had sexual intercourse in high school. Fewer smoke than in the past or drink or take drugs. Few ever read a newspaper. Most learn about the news on their cell phones or on late-night television. Most do not consider themselves religious and have no recollection of any biblical references. Most believe that there are more than 2 genders. 1 in 6 has a diagnosed mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder, and an absolute majority report high rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and stress, as well as hopelessness, fearfulness, and despair. And, to cap it off, certain developmental tasks have clearly become much more difficult than in the past. Achieving independence from parents, developing strong peer connections, and the like. Here are my takeaways from what we've learned over the past couple of days. The first is there is nothing new under the sun. That is, there are remarkable, unexpected, largely neglected historical continuities. That what we think is novel about our time is anything but novel. Historical precedents abound, and we have much to learn from them. Many of the developments that occurred during the last 3 years were utterly predictable, had anyone known anything about the past. My second takeaway is children as pawns, as ping pong balls or shuttlecocks. It's not just that children's lives are shaped by forces bigger than themselves, but they're used as expressions or instruments of adult agendas. They are held hostage to what adults want. Third, and this is, I think, one of the themes that we need to explore in greater detail, is that children are both vulnerable and they are resilient. They are victims, wounded and scarred in many cases, but they're also adaptable and irrepressible. Many show symptoms of trauma, yet their ability to adapt to changing circumstances is clearly superior to most adults. Fourth takeaway, is the romanticization of childhood that keeps us from looking at childhood with clear eyes. And it can be seen, for example, in the memorialization of children in the past. This image of childhood that doesn't tell us anything about the real problems that children experienced in the past, and therefore is profoundly misleading. So we have a vision of renewal, redemption, assimilation, a story of success, but we don't learn about the trauma that earlier generations experienced, the guilt that many children felt, or what Bengt or Lawrence Stone were talking about, the children who were left emotionally scarred and even crippled by the experience that they went through. And all this romanticization disguises the larger forces that are changing or impacting upon children's lives. Fifth, concluding thought. This country thinks of itself as a child-friendly society. And I guess we think of this world as a child-friendly world. But it isn't, of course. We can talk about different forms of violence directed against children, real violence, that is, physical abuse or sexual abuse, but most of the violence inflicted against children is more indirect. There's what I'd call the violence of labeling, of taking normal childish behavior and then imposing a psychological label upon it that implies that children are abnormal. Then there's the violence of expectations, expecting children to behave in ways that we expect of adults that most adults are incapable of doing anyway, that imposes undue burdens on children. Then there's the violence of representation. I mean, we live in a society that punishes pedophilia more than any other crime, and yet you look at advertisements and it's hard to tell the difference. Right. Many of the child models who are featured on our fashion magazines are 10, 11, 12, 13 years old because you don't want any crow's nests on their faces. And then there's the deeper forms of violence, the violence of poverty. Even if it's only 5%, it's still terrible. And that's, of course, grossly misleading, I think. And the violence of displacement that we've spent so much time talking about. We expect children to be resilient. We expect them to adapt, to adjust, to grow up fast. We expect them to be able to cope with circumstances that I certainly wouldn't have been able to cope with at the same age of them. But even the most privileged children in our society, I think, do not get much of a childhood in this society. The amount of unstructured, unsupervised play has dramatically declined during my lifetime. The K-12 curriculum has become almost obsessively focused, in theory, on math and reading to the exclusion of the arts. and hasn't even been successful in those areas. The schooling that I grew up with, which was essentially a social experience, that is long gone. If we really want to be a child-friendly society, we have a lot of priorities that need to change. And there's no question what we should focus on. We should focus on the most vulnerable children. We know who those are. And we need to help them and to place their priorities above our own. Thank you.
Would any of our speakers like to respond to any or all of our commenters? Yeah, by all means.
You know, maybe based on the work I'm doing now, but it's interesting that we didn't talk about the world, again, the United States, about the way corporations shape childhood. The role of and I'm thinking about something I just read today that Jason Chernowski sent me, which is about how effectively opiate manufacturers targeted doctors to give opiates to children, right? So we might talk about drug abuse in families and its effects, but we're abusing our children with a lot of prescribing, for example, because of the corporate interest.
Which opiates? I'm curious.
All of the Oxycontins, all of that.
Are being given to children.
Yeah, well, yes, there was a targeted effort to, you know, you injured yourself on the playground. What do you need? You need opiates. I know that.
Didn't know that.
Yes, it's, you know, and that's just one example of the way children are targeted, taught to become consumers, taught what to consume, taught to shape their families' expenditures towards these needed things, taught to have their families push for, you know, when we say we're not supporting children, we don't have a social safety net. Well, that's right, because our tax dollars are going to the opiate manufacturers. I'm using them as a model. It's going to the corporations. It's not going to families. And the more their children demand to be part of, and parents expect to be part of the consumer culture world, and we prop up those consumer-focused corporations and others, the polluters, et cetera, the more we're harming children. But we don't say we're harming children. We don't say, oh, let's give tax breaks to Exxon so our children can't breathe. So I really feel like we've left out that structural overlay, and that's because, and I'll blame myself, as historians, sometimes we're reading the wrong literature. If you go to the Standard & Poor's and the business literature, and you read about, you know, people, you'll say, okay, we're smoking cigarettes less. That's right, we are in the United States, our kids are smoking less. And that's because there was a targeted effort to say, you know, the American population is relatively small. If we could get everybody in China, India, and Africa smoking cigarettes, we don't need those American kids. So we, you know, our corporate world is also part of a larger environmental world. Okay, I'll put up some windmills here in Texas and not, you know, instead of another oil well, because I can collude people in Nigeria. I can kill all those children. So I really feel like we can't talk about children in the 21st century and in the 20th and probably in the 19th, if I took more time to think about it, without talking about the way that world is shaped by industrial and post-industrial capitalism.
So, thank you for that. And taking off on that, when I was in grad school, I was in a department that was really, really about sort of social and increasingly about cultural history, and that those were imagined as the spaces where the really important critiques were happening. And in fields where we work on migration, the idea that, you know, the state is becoming increasingly irrelevant and so on, and let's focus on these cultural critiques, right? As I started attempting to write about children through a cultural historian's lens, I was led inevitably back to the state. and back to adults. And so I appreciate Chris and Steve, your comments about let's keep the state in this conversation, and Bengt for that matter, and the idea of children as pawns of adults. That has become the entire through line of my scholarship, is the way that children are operationalized by adults for their own ends, right? I understand that means that some of my work flies in the face of other trends within the history of childhood where there's a focus on children's voices and children's agency, both of which I think are extremely important, right? At the same time, I think that we have to, rather than an either or approach, we really need to be doing the next generation of our scholarship in an and way, where we are remembering that children have agency, but that their agency is deeply prescribed by the state and by adults, right? And that we do this kind of relational work where we remember the role of the state and adults, right? For me, focusing on adults and the state is also sort of a political and a moral commitment. Accountability, right? For adults who vote, who spend money, who make choices for children, right? We have to maintain our critical eye on the adults as well if we're going to advocate for children, right? If we're going to cross into that space. And then finally, that leads me to just one last thought on sort of the dangers of the opposite, the dangers of going so far down that road of sort of adults in the states are the only actor and children are only victims, and right, that can be problematic too. One of the reasons why I think that is problematic is not just on a philosophical level that children have agency, but because of what thinking of children as victims does politically, right? When we think of children as victims, when we use images of children as victims in order to press for change, for example, when migration activists focus on unaccompanied children and represent them to us as if they were all 5 years old, when in fact the majority of them, as Paula said, we're talking about adolescents, right? That age distinction is extremely important. Activists represent them as little because then it resonates with ideas we have about victimhood and sympathy, right? Now, I understand why activists do this. They're using whatever tool they have available to them, right? But the problem there also is that victimhood produces what response? It produces empathy and sympathy, right? It allows us to virtue signal to one another through our sympathy for children, which is different from taking seriously their rights and demanding that the state and adult actors enact justice for children, right? So my concern with, the image of the child as the victim is largely a political one, because it lets us off the hook. It lets us feel bad for them and then feel good about ourselves for feeling bad for them, rather than thinking that this is a responsibility of the state to provide for human beings who happen to be children, and now let's do something about it, right? So, anyway.
I take what you have to say, but I have a very different view on that. And my view as a historian is that our obligation is to see what the children are actually like. I mean, the activism can be an individual thing that individuals do. But as historians and as a profession of historians, our objective is to try to get at an honest understanding of children's lives, past and present. And it's only that honesty and that understanding that it's going to actually serve their purposes. And so if you begin with a political agenda, you're going to end with the agenda you began with. And it's not going to take into consideration the reality of what those children are experiencing. One of the things, for example, that has been missing from this conversation is peers, except for the conversation yesterday, where the peer groups within the violent high schools took place and created. But peers are fundamental, and they are actually the source of the agency of adolescents. It is because adolescents lean on their peers and not on adults that they can have agential behavior. And we haven't talked about peers. So I think that if we look at the reality of children, then rather than just the state and our obligations through the state, we get a different picture of childhood. And we're more honest about what the reality has been in the past and what the future will hold. Okay, so anyway, that's...
No, to be clear, I'm not saying one versus the other. I'm saying and, right? I think we really need both of those things.
Well, I wanted to go back to that online question about the long-term effects of trauma. And the answer is it really depends on the kid. I mean, the research, you could have identical twins who had gone through adverse childhood experiences and have very different outcomes. I think that's important. And there's research by George Bonanno at Columbia who basically says that the lesson of trauma is that it's a lesson of resilience, that only 25% have PTSD. Most people have a traumatic experience and quickly recover from it. So I think that our narrative of trauma, and that in my field does the worst to the popular conversation in popularizing this idea that there's emotional determinism, that if you have a traumatic experience, it's going to affect you for the rest of your life. The other thing that the other thing we haven't talked about much is gender. And if we look at children, for example, first of all, girls are much more vulnerable to sexual abuse, but also they're much more vulnerable to internalizing disorders as opposed to externalizing. So I was interested in the two representations, like in yours, Federica, the kids became sort of overbehaved, they were very compliant, and I think in his or somebody's other, they were acting out and being much, and I would guess that the ones who were acting out were more likely boys, and the ones who were much more compliant were much more girls. So we know that girls are more internalizers with depression, with anxiety, with self-harming. Boys are much more externalizers with rebellion, with aggression, with acting out. And my final comment is just a saying that economists talk about what's possible and sociologists tell you why it's not possible. And, so, and I kind of kept having this sinking feeling the whole weekend of like, oh, that's such a great idea. Yeah, this is the United States. It's never going to happen. So that's my happy note. I think so.
There was an interesting question on the internet directed towards us, which has to do with the commercial determinants of health, following up on what Janet was saying, and the commercial exploitation of children. And here, just as some quick thoughts, one is we shouldn't think of commercialization just as by companies. I mean, clearly that's the most obvious example. Advertising, fashion, and the like, we now play on young children with the same wiles we use at adults. No question about that, but professionals also benefit from children. And we have to be very careful about that. When we medicalize normal childish behavior, when we psychologize normal childish behavior, we are doing something for our benefit that I can assure you does not benefit the children in most cases. So we have to be very, very self-questioning about what is for our benefit and what is for children's benefit. Others have thoughts about this?
I just want to say that I think it's important for us to realize too, though, that this dependence on adolescents that adolescents have on other adolescents is something we've created as a modern circumstance.
Oh, yes.
This is, so it's, it's almost like it's a psychotic sort of, dependency, because for most of human history, there's been much more intergenerational dependence. And maybe part of the reason why kids don't go to an adult when they see something scary is because we've created this age-based social connection that seems to be the ultimate social connection. So, and then another point that I think is something that as I get older and come around people who become increasingly dependent, is that I'm not sure we're ever not children. You know, when do we not become children? I think we become at a stage of life where we're considered to be, that we have to be economically independent, that we have to be able to maybe care and help care for others. But then we also become a time in our life where we can't even really take care of ourselves if we last that long. So I'm not sure we're, you know, I kind of think one of the things that we've done in modern society, and it fits sort of Janice's commercialization idea too, is we're all vulnerable to that. Kids are too. And, you know, when are we going to step up and say, the future is more important than today, and that, you know, dealing with climate and dealing with people's health so that they can be increasingly less dependent throughout their lives, that these are the things that are important to us. So it does all kind of come back to where our priorities and values are. And I'm just to the point where I don't think there is anybody that's an adult.
Bengt set his hand up, and then Joanna, if she's still interested, and then Amanda, and then Frederica.
Yeah, and I think that what
Especially this guy.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
We've known each other a long time.
I've been playing all my life, yes. But I think that what you now said exactly is actually the meaning of that you should distinguish between children as being and becoming, and the fact that we are always becoming.
We're always becoming.
And so, I mean, so there's really we're always changing. And definitely we carry with us our childhood all the time, and we are children in many ways all the time. So, but at the same time, I choose not to agree with you about the youth.
About you?
About youth as a modern construct. I'm quite sure that the youth has played the peers has played a tremendous role all the way down in history, as much as the adults, depending on different cultures, depending on situations and stuff like that. So there's no clear distinctions between that. But I also think that there's a methodological point to do when you study children that I take from you when you initiate this issue about the commercialization of drugs and towards youth, towards children here, is sometimes that we study children, we tend to focus too much on children. And I thought sometimes my methodological advice had always been defocus children. Defocus that and look at everything else that goes on. I mean, what did it mean that suddenly the tax system in 1970s was changed in Sweden, so you taxed women and children differently, women and men differently? Well, that was the very basis for some of the workforce expansion of women in this. Stuff like that. And that in itself had an effect on childcare. It had an effect on the building of public services for women to service both men and women, but actually service women more. So the point is really that you have to start thinking about that. And that also was that I kind of took home from the COVID experience, in a sense, that the fact that COVID showed us that schools are so much more than education. It is so much more, and it's also so clearly also in terms of how we look at schools and how we look at it. Otherwise, we would tend to it as only a cognitive thing. But now we could see this there where you meet your peers. That's where you break out of your isolation. There where you find a compensatory situation and stuff like that. And a lot of things happen there, which just goes far beyond what we can comprehend. In support, in agency, and whatnot. And we need to understand that and study that. And that also comes to the notion of what goes on in terms, when I looked at the figures and prepared myself for coming here, thinking about what was the effect of COVID on the education. Well, as I pointed out, the schools were open in Sweden. But it also had an effect, and some schools were closed in higher echelons. And you get quite clear that the effects on the cognitive side was clearer on the higher ages, like grades 8 and 9, and then at the gymnasium. The interesting thing is that the effects was evaluated differently by different groups. The local school authorities thought the effect wasn't all that great. The headmasters of the school thought they were a little bit greater. The teachers thought they were even more great. And the students thought they were even more. So you have a different kind of levels of evaluation. And that then brings me to the other thing there. A lot of schools, we have a charter system in Sweden where we finance big multinational educational corporations to teach our children. These corporations have less educated teachers, cheaper schooling places, less special education, less support of children in needs and stuff like that. And they evaluated the effects of the COVID less than everybody else. And they gave better grades during the whole period. And this is actually something that you could evaluate what that means. But it also shows and proves the point here that we have to look at the different agencies acting out and trying to take advantage of even a situation like that, or in reality, I mean, it's not that, in reality taking advantage of it, but it also shows to prove that actually, governance and government plays a role, because the one that was most caring about what was going on was the non-commercial activities, non-commercial agencies here.
Joanna has.
Yeah, Joanna had her hand up before. I don't know if you still want to comment, Joanna.
Well, this has been a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for all the remarks, and please forgive me if you can hear the loud noise. There is a Guy Fawkes day today, and you might hear fireworks. But I wanted to address the issue of which I think that Paula has raised, that we need to explore further the intersection between the psychological and historical. And that's very important to understand the varieties of traumas, even if we can, there is no one comprehensive, of course, understanding or definition of trauma, and there are also conflicting interpretations of trauma. We also have to keep that in mind. But I believe that looking at the voices of children with different levels of agency, of course, and limited sense of agency and greater agency, children that attempted to exercise agency and succeeded to great extent, to lesser degree. And of course, we have variety of situation in peacetime societies and wartime genocidal societies that I deal with. If we look closely at the sources, the diaries, the letters, the memoirs, and if we written at different times of the child's chronological lives, then I believe that we can grasp the fact that we as humans are psychological products shaped by the environment that is shaped by the history. And in this macro histories, and we can actually see the impact of the history, policies, politics, culture, displacement, insecurities. I think through that concept actually of lived history, when we very rarely actually listen to the voices of child survivors or and very often, I mean, Paula also mentioned concept of death, and talking about maltreatment of children in peacetime societies with the rise of deaths of children, where social workers actually don't even, and this is not only an American case, but I followed, if you look at the British case, did not attempt to see the children. They were so vulnerable, and they were trying to convey to them that actually their stepmom and dad don't like them, yes, and do different things to them. And as a result, these children were killed, were murdered. And there's so many cases. We learn and more about such cases. So to me, there is a fundamental actually failure of us as adults representing different institutions of listening to children. And that takes me to my other remark, and I think also that has been mentioned about the issue of the best interests of children. We actually need like a global study of the concept of best interests of children from 45 to the present, how different agencies, social workers, educators, etc., understood that and that concept. And then we need to juxtapose that with the children who went through particular experiences. And then only then we'll actually see the vulnerability of the children and the fact that very often they're the pose of adult actions.
Amanda? Yeah.
Great. Yeah. This has been a really fruitful conversation. I think I have three, I want to pull together a couple different strands. First, to touch on your point, Paula, about peer culture and its significance. I mean, I do think that like my evidence speaks to that about these kids in schools, and that the terror that they felt, the worst of the terror was the terror of being exposed to their peers, and the fear of the social impact of that. Even, you know, and that terror was even more intense than the fear of like physical assault and sort of and bullying and humiliation, and, you know, by, you know, within their families or by teachers, right? They always emphasize the peer dimensions of it as being the most painful. And in certain cases, like with Robert Rosencrantz's case, that peer humiliation being the thing that drove him to actually commit violence, right? So it's,
Yes.
I think that's like very real and very intense. And it is important to think about schools as societies, you know, and as, right, go back to some of your earlier work, but like, and as schools as sites of peer culture, and in which, you know, peer culture is generated and circulated and in which it evolves. Gender, to follow up on Josh's point, I absolutely, even historically, see evidence of that internalized versus externalized, those differences, but I think we're not, I think if we reduce that to girls versus boys, we're missing a lot. I think as we continue to think about childhood and gender, we really need to be able to differentiate assigned sex at birth from gender and gender identity, and not just in this present moment, but in the past. So, well, not just that, but about like the way that different children are gendered. So the more feminine boys, gay boys, right, were not attacking other boys or being attacked necessarily physically by other boys, but they were withdrawing and they were being quiet and they were trying to hide, right? And whereas like Robert Rosencrantz, who committed violence, was someone, I didn't mention this, super masculine, hyper masculine, really into cars, like really had this, into computers. So many of the letters to him and the ones that he returned were about cars. Was not one of the things that I happened to find more engaging. And it was in a way precisely that he was like, I am a real guy here and I'm still getting attacked. And it was the outrage that he felt as a masculine young man that he was humiliated in that way, that it was a gendered form of humiliation that's totally different from like effeminate gay boys and the kinds of, you know, discursive, you know, violence and actual violence that they experienced. Whereas with girls, what I found is that the femme girls, the little gender conforming girls who looked like all the other little girls, they suffered because they were totally invisible. And they had no way of being identified by one another. And so they internalized it, they stayed quiet. They grew up, they married men, and they came out in their 40s. And then they divorced their husbands and they lost custody of their children in the 70s. You know, I mean, it's just like that gender matters so much. Whereas the little butch girls were very identifiable to each other, and they could form a little society, and they, you know, got girlfriends more easily. But they also got kicked out of their houses and beaten up, you know? So I don't want us to map gender onto sex. And then especially in the current moment when so many of these queer kids are non-binary and trans. And they're, and I want to think about trans as we are in trans studies these days, which is mobility across gendered borders, not just like from one box to another, and third gender categories with non-binary. So many kids are coming out as non-binary. I mean, at elementary schools, right? Really young, younger than ever. And so I want us to like think in slightly more robust ways about gender. And finally, the social science connection. I find that so compelling. And one of the ways that I find it compelling is that I have found that my students who, I think that there is that a protective factor for trauma can occur. We can enhance children's and young adults' sort of abilities to be resilient and to find and to develop protective factors by enhancing their sense of connection and community and solidarity. And I think that can even happen through historical study. So I've had student research assistants who have coded oral history interviews for me, most of them trans, actually, the students, who have said after 2 semesters of doing this that they feel safer in their own lives because they know that people went through this before. They know that they're not alone, not only in the present moment, but in a intergenerational sense. And that if people could get through what trans folks in the 60s got through, or, queer kids in the 70s got through, they can manage, right? And so I think in thinking more about interdisciplinary collaborations is that make historical material more accessible to the relevant and impacted communities of kids and young adults now has a lot of potential, but it requires us to collaborate. It requires us to do some different forms of publishing, right? To work with K-12 educators on curriculum in public schools, to teach differently and to create different levels and kinds of access, I think, to the work that we're doing. Yeah.
Frederica is next, and then Jill.
Yeah, I think I'm going to relate to what you were saying, because I'm facing still, after these last 2 days of discussion, the difficulty of what is trauma, how do we deal with the term, when can we apply it, when should we rather talk about harm, because we are talking here about the escape from the Holocaust, so where survival was endangered. After the First World War, where children could starve. Is that the same than if children were mobbed because of their sexual identity, if they have been raised by a narcissistic mother, and they suffer from that? When they call it their own trauma, is it enough that the children sort of describe themselves as traumatic because that's how they feel? Or is it a psychological analysis which sort of gives us a right to call something traumatic? Or do we as historians, can we dare to make a categorization of what is real trauma? So I think the voice of the child on the one hand, the psychologist is there, we as historians, what do we do with that? So and then number one major problem 2, we often have competent, high-functioning beings. We face, so you said that siblings, A is coping well, manages, is living a successful life, the other one doesn't. What does it mean? The child is resilient, so it doesn't respond the same way as his sibling to trauma, but the trauma itself might still have been the same. It's just the response to the trauma. What does it? So how do we deal that? Both were exposed to the same difficulties in life, but we as historians consider that the child was resilient, so everything is fine. The life story is fine. So I think on the one hand, the perspective on life stories. Life courses tells us perhaps often more than the subjective evaluations of the children themselves. Because that is just a Momentaufnahme, so an analysis of a moment. But I think the life stories tell us perhaps more about what the implications of a certain experience was.
Can I speak to that briefly? I don't know if there was a lot.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then Jill.
You're the psychologist.
Well, I have two thoughts about that. One is self-report measures versus other so-called objective analyses, self-report, can be distorted in either way. It can be, one can report themselves as being more resilient, as earlier generations might, or you might report yourself as being more traumatized, as I would say contemporary generations might. The other is a really interesting field. I think it comes out of genetics research, so your husband will know about. But it's the dandelion versus the orchid children. Have you heard of this phenomenon? Yeah, where dandelion kids have a genetic, it's considered a phenotype, that they can sort of, no matter what environment that you put them in, they would thrive. They would kind of land on their feet. They're called dandelions because they're just going to kind of float around and land somewhere and flourish. Whereas the orchid children have a certain kind of, I can't recall whether it's phenotype or genotype. Somebody correct me. But
Genotype.
is it?
Phenotype is your physical.
Where their phenotype is such that if they're put in really ideal circumstances, such as really careful parenting, very nurturing environment, they do better than anybody. But if they're not, they do worse than anybody. They become sociopathic. They become addicted. So I mean, to me, that also highlights how these genetic differences can really affect who somebody is and the outcomes in life.
But then just last, because for lunch we talked about epigenetics. If
Yeah.
then again the genetic constitution of a person, it's not either unrelated from the past, because the past, the history of the family or of that line might have impacted the genetic constitution of that one personality and the responses again to certain traumatic events.
Yeah, absolutely. No, your point
I have no
about
clue. So
epigenetics is really well taken.
But I think the answer is, like I was saying earlier, there is no either or. There is no one thing that's going to tell us the story. Children's voices are very important, but alone, if they are interpreted without context, then things get missed. Focusing exclusively on context and structure misses the vitality and the uniqueness of children's experience, right? Genetics by itself is never going to be the answer. It's an and situation, right?
I will say, though, I think there is a danger, though, in labels and getting too narrow with labels. So, for example, as a foster parent, I never told the school or the teacher that the child I was bringing to school was a foster child, because as soon as I did, there was a label that, this child was damaged, and therefore either expectations were lowered or, there were certain kind of behaviors put on them. So I think as historians, even as we're studying these subjects, I think we also have to be careful about these labels.
But the interesting thing there is, when you're saying that, is the, what's his name, that's talked about schooling and school shootings, was basically the thing is that the different branches of schools were separated from each other. So since you did not bring the history with it, you didn't label the kids. So those who took in the kid didn't know that kid had a problem.
Right? But, carrying an individual child's vulnerabilities maybe is one thing, but then labeling certain things that happen to somebody as trauma.
Exactly.
And having that, I mean, that's what Frederica's asking about, and I think that's important.
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful with the term trauma. I absolutely think we have to be careful.
Jill, go ahead.
Just brief. So I think I'm going to connect back to what Joanna said and connect all to Federica, because I think we're playing with this idea of definitions, and they're very slippery, and they're not only slippery in the moment, but they're slippery historically. And what right do we have to put a name? Who are we to name something, particularly when it happened in the past? And I think going back to your comments, Joanna, you were mentioning this notion of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that there's this best interest standard, and that is not a universal standard in any way. So you mentioned different nations. Some of the work that we've been doing lately, really in child protection, best interest of the child is not a national phenomenon. It is a local phenomenon. It is a cultural phenomenon. It is a tribal phenomenon, and it is vastly different within the same geography, but conceptualized differently. Different laws might apply within a single country as to how you implement a best interest standard. So we have no universal connectivity on that. It's just it's a nice phrase that we all like to use, and I know what it means for me, but I would anticipate it's quite different in this room.
I'm gonna let Joanna respond, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back and really easily wrap it all up into
That's something you will do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
I mean, when I thought about this global history of the concept of the best interest of the child, of course, I had in mind the policies that emerged after the Second World War towards different groups of displaced children, and that and of course, I fully agree with you that the best interest of the child is a concept that has very different meaning in different settings to different agencies. But I think in terms of examining impact of the big history, like the Second World War, the post 1945, changing attitudes, recognition of the child's rights, which actually also, as we know, has taken such a long time, looking at particular moments. And of course, I'm speaking here from the perspective of someone who examined childhood during war and genocide. I think we could actually grasp the differences, also the messiness of events. When, for example, I can give you one quick example. When it comes to children, unaccompanied non-Jewish children, Polish and Ukrainian children, who became adopted, fostered by German farmers after 1945, and the American military actually didn't want necessarily to take the children out of these families, whereas the Western Child Welfare Organization, UNRWA and others, they actually were very keen on removing those children and bringing them back to families. There were also certain situations where these children are abandoned by their mothers who had relationship with Germans. So it was a very messy and complex situation. And of course, even in retrospection, if you read Gita Sereni's recollections of that situation, it was, do we leave these children to the Nazis, basically, and confirm that the Nazis project, yes, won? Or do they take these children to the hands of the horrible regime, communist regime? But there are also different layers, how these children felt, how themselves felt about what had happened, and there is a number of different points of views. And so what I wanted to actually say is that we cannot compare everything. And I mean, we have covered such a huge range of issues. For example, I love the book on the children as dandelion and orchids, written by an author whose sister was an orchid, and he was a dandelion. Yes, but I'm not sure if I could use this book to study experiences of siblings emerging from war and genocide. I would be very. I would have to think about that very carefully. But what we know, that historical context matters. Yes, absolutely. We have the voices of children, and examining them over a long period of time, perhaps as you might think that in some ways as a Holocaust scholar, I'm lucky because I have such a huge amount of sources. But the same can be done, I mean, with the studies of Armenian genocide. I recently, at the conference that I convened about experiences of children during the war, where we look specifically at the Second World War, but we also look at going back to the Armenian genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. And here there were some elements, children who were forcibly adopted, and they had changed their religion, what the recollections, the memories. So there are some ways of comparisons, but we of course we cannot compare oranges and apples. That's very important. So, I mean, this workshop made me aware that there are fantastic ways. There are so many different ways of comparing different aspects of certain groups emerging from war and genocides. And then there are aspects of studying insecurities in different national contexts. I mean, if we think about COVID and the impact of COVID on children and the issue of maltreatment, I think we could conduct studies looking at Western countries as well as Eastern countries. So there is a phenomenal number of possibilities, but we need certain centers, we need certain well-thought projects for comparisons. So we need centers, we need forums, we need collaborations that will help us to identify the issues that we can study together and issues that we cannot study together because that would be too far-fetched.
Another participant this weekend, Lindenmeyer, who is the editor of the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth. The idea being that it might be possible to assemble some of the thoughts, the papers that were given in some form of publication. But I don't know that in any way that form was set. So I don't know if the organizers would like to say a little bit about what the possibilities were and lay out some of the options for everyone.
Linda suggested there could be a themed edition of, or issue or from the journal that some of the papers might participate in. So that would be probably a pretty traditional, journal publication. We can certainly talk with Linda more about that, individuals who would be interested. The other thing that I thought maybe we could talk about as a group is, what are other possibilities, though? We have terrifically videoed Zoom presentations that they're going to send me that we're going to do some kind of editing on, but put them up on the internet, probably through YouTube site. We have the SHCY YouTube site, and do that. So are there other sorts of things that we could do along with that? Say, for example, would people be comfortable summarizing everything that they think is important to say in, say, 500 words? An abstract that we could post with these. If you have other kinds of ideas, let me know. This is the time to talk about this, because one thing that I think is important to think about with this kind of a wonderful intellectual experience for us is there a way to have an outcome, a scholarly outcome from this that makes it have a little bit longer life than our own memories? So, ideas.
Well, I think that we should actually use the journal not to write regular papers out of this, but to have each of the participants give not 500 words, but their 15-minute talks, and that those should be edited. We could even, each of us could add 5 minutes of our concluding remarks if we wanted to. I think that would be an extremely useful thing to put out in the journal.
Useful, but in the context of the journal publication, the way it is, I don't think it's possible.
Why?
It'd be too long.
I don't know if
No.
if it really is short papers though, it wouldn't be too long. I think if everyone writes a whole journal article, that's not going to fit. That's not going to work.
That's
But something that was shorter, like 7 pages a piece or something like that.
Like a 900 to 1,200 kind of words kind of a thing.
Or even 1,500, I think could, well, if you add up the number. No, add up the number. I think we could do and everyone doesn't want to do 1,500. Some people want to do 700. So it's the contributions, the multiple contributions.
If there's short pieces like that, I think it might be possible. Of course, I mean, I hate to speak for Linda, so I don't know exactly, what she would think of that, but I could see something like that. But I do know that we are limited on the number of pages that we can have in the publication.
Or you could have 2 consecutive.
Right. And then the other, kind of thing is it's a peer-reviewed, scholarly journal published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So, what's the footnoting? I would think we don't have to do that much, but I think there would have to be some of that, so.
I think there are 2 ways that I think there could be a little wiggle room. One, I think it's conceivable that Linda could omit the reviews in an issue, which would allow for more pages if it did get into more pages. And I know she has published in the past so the proceedings of a conference panel, because I was on one of those, and I don't think that they were in the end peer-reviewed. I think Mike Grossberg read the one, because he had chaired it, and he gave some suggestions to each of us, but it was not an anonymous sort of process.
Right.
So I think it's allowed, basically.
Couldn't we have the organizers provide some anonymous comments for revision, and then each of us, do those revisions? I mean, I do like the idea of peer review.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that perhaps the fact that we were selected by the organizers constitutes already the first stage of the process of peer review. But then, don't tell me if it was Paula or Steve, but send me back my paper and say, tweak this, footnote this, where's your evidence, right? And just, because it's certainly for those of us that are still constantly being reviewed for our academic productivity, it's more valuable for us to have our paper actually be peer reviewed, right?
Fair.
Can I just add one thought to that I would even not care if it's anonymous, because I think it would be fantastic if I would get the feedback from 2 of you, even as well as the co-authors. I think that would be enough if you simply say that the 2 of you comment on your introduction. So I think as a group we have enough knowledge of how to review, so I wouldn't need the anonymous part. But I wondered, because it's a journal, so I guess it's not open access, and I wondered if we don't want to have a wide audience. For that, I would wonder if the homepage of the Society for the History of Chartered and Use would not perhaps be a better outlet to have something like, if it's not anyway not normal text, if it should be rather perhaps a blog, and we create an open access blog. It's for us, not for me. I'm speaking against myself because I should have publications. But in order to achieve an audience and to circulate those ideas, it might perhaps be better to look for an open access outlet.
I wonder if there's a both and there. If we could do like a really, really short
one-page thing
version for the website that sort of invites people, if possible, to then read the longer pieces in the journal.
And I think that's really more kind of what I was suggesting to begin with, is really short sort of abstracts that might draw attention. And then if those of you who want to have a longer publication, that would be in a peer-reviewed journal. But it could still be 1,500 words. I mean, because we are limited how many.
Your proposal should be on the homepage as a full text.
I have no clue how the homepage works, and if there's some format which could be open access and accessible for many. I also once edited a double special issue, so one could also do 2 themed issues if we want longer pieces, and have in addition these short pieces on the homepage.
I don't know. I'm a little reluctant to promise too much because we actually are looking for a new editor for the journal as of June. So Linda is only willing to talk about, the next issue for and it's her last one. So,
But this is something we could propose to the next editor.
well, we don't have a
and-
next
and
editor yet. I'm
Well,
worried
well,
about
when
that.
we have a
Yeah,
next
I actually think this
editor.
would be enormously appealing to
I
the next
agree.
editor
I
because
agree.
then it's something that's done.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
It's there, it's available to you, and this material can, each of you could produce this within a month easily. So we'd have it literally in place once it's reviewed and edited or whatever. I think that's our best technique at this point.
Okay.
Even if it means, as Nick says, no book reviews in that particular edition.
Yeah, that I have, I mean, I
Well,
have
that
no
would be up
idea.
to the editor.
That's
I
up
mean,
to
that's
the
something
editor.
we don't have any control over.
Mean that there's some room for reviews. I mean, personally, I would be interested in writing like a normal length paper that as I was researching to prepare for this, I was working on an article because my assumption was that was what was being looked for.
I mean, the
And
other,
could we possibly think about an edited book then?
well, you get to work on that.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good
It
idea.
is productive.
But let me just tell you the disadvantage of that.
Yeah.
If we did that, you would not get David Oshinsky to write you a long piece for that. He'd be willing.
Variety?
Well, I think we would lose some of the variety that we had. I'm not sure Josh would write you a long article on that.
Depends what you mean by long.
Right, what I'm
What?
saying is so.
Depends what you mean by long.
Could you
Right,
have
well, but I mean a really
Josh writes a lot.
full-fledged kind of scholarly piece. I'm not sure.
Not
In other
sure.
words, there are historians here
Right.
who'd be willing to do that, but whether Jill or Josh or David Hutchinson, well, maybe Jill, but the pieces,
I'm with Jill,
pieces
yeah,
that we
exactly.
had were so good and provocative. But anyway, just one voice.
Could we, within one or two special editions, could we have both, right? Could we have a section that is voices where shorter pieces were put together and then a couple of standalone longer articles?
So I think Anita is going to make a proposal for being the next journal editor.
Oh my.
I
No, I'm
think
just
that
teasing.
the thought of an edited book that could be a journal, but or a special edition of a journal, but probably makes more sense as a book. I was just thinking during our break about some of the themes that I saw percolating here, larger themes that interconnect the various presentations. The first one has to do with the history of the present. Many of the papers, I think really all of the presentations, were about the present, but giving it a broader context. Usually we think of history as the past, but really, I think history's about long-term processes that manifest themselves at various points in time. And all the papers, when you talked about the pandemic in 1918, it was completely in the guise of understanding what's going on today and showing the parallels. And that's history, right? But it's a different kind of history than we often have written in the past, which is much more situated entirely in the past without concern of the present. Then the second theme that struck me, you all remember a book called The Hidden Injuries of Class, but many of our discussions were about the hidden injuries of childhood. Those exist on a spectrum. They range from teasing, taunting, bullying, to physical and sexual abuse and other kinds of family maltreatment and neglect. They range from family breakup to forced migration. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of those. A third theme is that what we call progress is way more complex than progress. It's the privatization of the family in most cases, the technologizing and commercialization of childhood, extreme parental over-involvement and overprotectiveness. We call that progress, but its impact on children is a little ambiguous.
And then medicalization of childhood.
Yeah, I thought I had, that's my next, the next one. The need to give history a sociological and psychological dimension in terms of socialization, how identity formation, whether that's class or gender or sexual or racial, has changed over time, And then next, age segregation, which is a really defining characteristic of our society. It's not new, but the power of the peer group and peer culture, I think, has become much more intense, abetted by social media, but clearly way more powerful than in the past. Because in the past, the peer groups were identifiable. They were the people you knew. Now, the impact is coming from elsewhere. And then finally, harm and trauma as concepts. What we consider violence has, of course, semantically expanded. And also we know that the language, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but the language of trauma has been seized and mobilized by activists. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's life. But it means that there's a tension between the psychology of trauma or the sociology of trauma and the way we use it in our everyday language. But those strike me as big themes that could really give a volume of some sort, real power.
You write the introduction. I do all the footwork.
Right?
Frederica?
Yeah, I agree with lots of the ideas, but I would be against an edited volume because we are talking about the present. If you do a book,
2 years.
then it comes out in three years. So I would like that we use this momentum
Exactly.
to get something out and to also give a purpose to the analysis of today, because otherwise it's something which in 3 years it's already fully outdated. So I think then perhaps we can go for some compromise between the very short pieces and the very long pieces, but still something what we could consider as substantial publication of,
3,500 words.
be it 10 pages instead of 20 pages. But that you could make some theoretical contribution, that we still talk on the big topics, but that we don't lose the momentum.
Well, one way
Because an
to do
edited
that
volume
is
that
even if the
builds.
journal was to end, if we don't find a successor to Linda, we can certainly do one more issue.
That's it.
Yeah, and it should be fast published. I would rather say,
Exactly.
give us 3 months to write the piece, have 1 month of peer review.
I mean, the fact is that we have editors right here. Linda doesn't have to edit it. And then if we find an editor, great, but you want to edit it?
I co-edit a book series. No, I'm not. No, I do want to say 2 things about. I mean, this was so powerful for me. So I think we want to talk to our peers in a whatever format, but I think there are 2 other places where I'd like to see this momentum continue. And one is, especially maybe for youth 4 and others, is sometimes it's good to address the public. And the Washington Post Made by History column, which I've written for a few times. You can send a pitch to Brian Rosenberg, and he's a wonderful editor. The other editor's on maternity leave, so. But and it's really about the past speaking to the present, and it's a wonderful audience there. It gets read. Or to History News Network, which has a readership of about 20,000, which is, let's say, my books have never been read by more than probably 150 people. So it's a big audience, and they're again interested in history speaking to the present. So there's a way to take what you've done and turn it to a public audience that's going to get that. And I would encourage you to do it. That would be number 1. The other thing is, I feel like there's so much momentum here that there should be a way for us to continue to gather and discuss this. So I thought, well, who's going to sponsor and take care of all the hard work of that? Because I don't want to do that again. And this is not necessarily the right title for this group, but the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine has all sorts of working groups that deal with, if we use the word pandemic, I mean, that's medicine, would fit under there. And they basically, some groups read an article and discuss it once a month. Some groups, people present works in progress. But there is a way for us to continue to meet virtually somebody has to coordinate and say, okay, it's your turn to put in a paper, or it's your turn, but it's not a lot of work, and it keeps the discussion alive. So, if that's of interest, I'll call you the big kahunas over here. Reach out to me, and I'll connect you to Babak Ashrafi, who coordinates that, and we'll see about getting that set up. But I would encourage you to, write something for History News Network. Write something for Made by History. It's a very fast turnaround. It has a real audience. The Washington Post gets read by, people in Washington who are capable of reading. It's a decreasing group, right? Looking at you, Marjorie Taylor Greene. But it is an outlet that gets you an audience, and I'm happy to work with you on that.
Yeah, but you're talking about individual papers.
Right. No, I'm saying in
power
addition.
is-
In addition, because we're gonna a journal issue is gonna talk to our peers, and we want them to take our material and use it instead of ignoring children. I mean, that's our goal overall. But we also have ideas that we want other people to think about. So it's like you say, end to end. End to end. That's gonna be my new phrase from now on.
Non-dualistic thinking.
Right, we can do everything. We can keep talking, we can talk to the public, we can talk to our peers.
I just would hate to lose the particular firepower of the interactions that we had.
I agree, when you put
That's all.
these
When
voices
you put
together
them
in
together,
a journal edition,
it was
reads
more than
very
any
interestingly.
individual contribution,
Yes.
and that's what I'd like to see. Without our creating a volume that'll appear in, it'll take
In
2 years to get a publisher, and then 2 more years to
And you
get
don't
it
get
produced.
even a publisher, so
I don't think that's gonna work, so we have to work with the journal. There is also the journal Childhood, which Barry Thorne used to be an editor on, so I mean, that's another possibility.
And another provocative thought, do we just want to stick it in the childhood circle? Or do we go for I know. Or do we go for a really big journal and convince them that this topic is so relevant for the general history?
Well, you have the journals about children's rights.
Oh, what about
No, you mean like the HR.
She's talking big time.
Yeah.
I mean, non-child related journals.
Like just big history.
Human rights.
Yeah, and I guess the 4 of you would have the power to get possible.
You'd be surprised how many now. What about history and theory?
These aren't articles like that. Those are completely postmodern.
They are.
Well, I also think that the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth has been so formative for, I mean, I can't speak for all of you, but for me, and I like the idea of us contributing an amazing addition for that journal.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
Good with that.
and maybe later we take over the
HA
or whatever.
HR.
Yeah.
But I would like to see this.
Yeah, I would too. So
Yeah.
we can certainly produce, by using our own power, another issue of that journal, even if it's the last one of this particular series.
I think Linda is certainly open to it again. I don't, unfortunately, because she's not here, I don't have enough details. But I think if you all shaped a proposal, who wants to?
And we do the internal peer review, and they don't need to be sent out.
I think they would probably be grateful for that, because the hardest thing right now is finding editors, is finding reviewers, so.
And I know actually that Linda has said that especially during the pandemic, even just the rate of submissions to the journal, which is true at all journals, has gone down. So she does not have an enormous queue of stuff that's waiting to be published. So I think she'd be open to this for sure.
I think we should, that should be where we are headed, is my.
I agree. I also really like the idea of a group where we could, I mean, I would want to keep the commitment modest, like maybe quarterly, not once a month probably, but yeah.
Somebody
just read something and keep the conversation going. I think it's an invigorating group and conversation. So
I do just want to go on the record as saying that some of the framing that you suggested is not sort of pandemic specific, and there could be a conversation for a longer term edited book volume that was framed in a way that isn't so specific to the moment.
I agree totally.
We could also propose a panel for the next Society for the History of Children and Youth Conference, which is going to be in Guelph in right. But is it?
We have a schedule at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the next one would be a year and a half out, right?
Yeah.
2.5 years.
Well, we could go to
But
we could go to
but
the
you don't
AHA
have
or
you have a
something.
panel schedule already?
So we've accepted the maximum number of panels
Oh yeah,
that we can
good.
accept.
All right,
yeah.
I'm glad to
Yeah.
hear that. I didn't
Yeah.
think it was that far.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Well, you could do the European Social Science History.
Also
meetings.
done, it's also this.
All right, nobody wants
Well,
us.
two of us.
We are going,
We're
they're doing the network
It'd
on
probably be
education.
for the next cycle, but then
Yeah.
we're so far out that we've lost
But
our.
actually, I mean, the European Social Sciences, sometimes you get late panel proposals sent in.
But as you're anyway the boss of that network, now there might be an option that you still, it's in Gothenburg in April
Yeah.
in Sweden.
Okay.
I think it's very short.
But that's a little, I think it's a little
bit
bit too late.
Yeah.
I mean, the panels are all set. That'll be an exercise of extraordinary, out of the rules.
But we could rather present the ready special issue at some point then, at a joint convention. So once it's out.
I mean, it's your careers at this point. I'm retired.
Me too. Okay, go for it.
So I'm willing.
They're speaking for themselves.
Well, I'm just saying,
What does she want to tell us?
I don't care what the format is. In other words, I'll help where I can.
Me too.
I'm willing to do work, but I want you to do what you want to do. I don't want you to think I have an agenda on this, because the whole idea of doing this was to help you perpetuate your work,
Correct.
going forward.
got it.
Because we
Yeah.
think,
And with you, it's kind of a more collective you, the younger generation.
right,
I don't feel young anymore.
well, just yeah. I always figure if you have to still work longer than you've worked already, you're still young.
Good definition.
The four of us have been very committed to this field, despite what Kriste said about all of us still being, or everyone is still a child. We have had
And
a
particularly me a little bit
categorical,
more than everybody else, I
we
understand.
have had
From my
a
friend here.
categorical vision that felt that children had actually been excluded from most historical work. In fact, from almost all historical work.
Yes.
And I think that we've now brought children to the attention of historians. And we want to that to continue. So that was part of what this is all about. And so we look to younger people to make sure that happens. I mean, we did have a commitment. However much of our childhood we still take with us, there are children differently defined in different societies and over different times, and that's part of the objective of digging them out of history, is figuring out where they fit into that larger picture. So we would love to have you continue in whatever ways are suitable for you.
I will be a little selfish in though that since I'm going to be working on editing along with Will and his wonderful team these presentations, that being able to have like 500 word abstracts would be terrific, because I think it speaks to Janet's point about wanting to have a more public audience, and this would be very public. And being married to a former journalist, I also know that journalists are always looking, and they're Googling all the time to find people who they think can speak to contemporary issues. So, it'd be one way to get your names out there for that kind of an audience.
Yes, definitely.
And that's an and, right?
That's an and.
Absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
give us a date.
So if you can send me 500-word abstracts as soon as you can, because I would say at this point, this is all fresh in your minds, but you know what the context of everybody else's presentations were. And if you could do that, that would be the best right now.
Thanks a lot. Speaking for the young generation, although I don't
Is
feel
it a
young
microphone?
although I don't feel young, I think we very much appreciate this sort of invitation to further shape the field. And I don't know you, but I'm very happy and willing to invest energy and time into that. Okay.
Great.
Excellent.
Yes, I echo that. Thank you to all
Yes.
of you for your scholarship, for your the
Inspiration.
mentorship that you've provided through the
The
years,
books you
whether you knew
wrote.
it or not.
The conference you organized.
Yes, the books that you wrote, the articles that all of us read and
You're all
cited
in our
in our own
footnotes, I think.
attempts.
Yeah, you're our footnotes.
Yes, you are. Yes, thanks for being our references. Yeah. Oh, it's a good thing.
I think that's really relevant.
That's really kind of you to
That's
say. I
very
appreciate
nice.
it.
Yes.
Now when I look in the mirror, I don't see just a cliche.
You see a footnote.
She sees a child.
Inner child.
Well, Nick, do you think we should adjourn our formal conference?
I think with thanks to all of you for organizing.